So I want to talk about language, how it shapes our rhetoric, how language helps people get a better understanding of our uh, how our world around us is shaped, how people interact with that world, and how our world is interacted with, uh, how people interact with that world, etc. Obviously, my language is not so good right now. So to be perfectly honest, this was inspired mostly by the tweet thread you see before you. Steve Cox is an independent running for Congress in California. He seems to be pretty cool. I've been following him here for a while. He's had some pretty good takes. He's somewhat Bernie or bust, which is kind of a knock against him. But other than that, he seems to be pretty straight and on the level. So I also kind of was inspired by the Mexi Vosh discussion from yesterday, which yeah, that was some bad shit. But in this thread here, I'll just go ahead and read it real quick. There are some common terms I use that often result in being corrected about what the proper term is, because those terms are disrespectful / hateful. Examples: homeless person or illegal immigrant. I understand the desire to try to remove the stigma from those people. But the thing is, you can only actually remove the stigma of being homeless or illegal by actually removing the stigma. That is to say, by changing how we actually think about those people. Changing the language doesn't do that. Calling someone undocumented doesn't improve their standing in our world. At all. All it really does is send a signal to token groups that you're on their side. Because it's about you, not them. This isn't an attack. I don't think most even realize it, but it's true. And when we change a term and start referring to people as undocumented or houseless, we put up communication barriers against those whom we need to educate and convince in order to fix it. If we are right, and I believe we are, about how and why to handle these issues, we will win that argument. And only then will we actually remove the stigma by making those people valuable members of our patchwork society, but we have to use familiar language. I say illegal immigrant because it's technically correct, and because I'm working to become a legislator, and I'd like to materially change their status from illegal immigrant to just immigrant by changing the goddamn laws. So please understand this if I ever react poorly to such a correction. I get upset because I abhor superficiality. It's essentially cosmetic. They're actually houseless people? That's the preferred nomenclature. I respect you for trying, but you're not helping. I don't harbor any negative feelings about homeless people or illegal immigrants at all. Those terms don't change that. We just need to aim a lot deeper than that if we're going to unsink this shit. And there was someone... I'm trying to remember... was it at the end of the thread? Yeah. No. Wait. So... someone responded to him, and I stuck my oar in briefly. Was it here? Yes. So someone came back. Do you believe that immigrants should be referred to as aliens? Because that's how USCIS refers to all immigrants, regardless of status. The reason people get upset is because it's dehumanizing language. How can a person be illegal if it's only a matter of documentation? To which I replied, I don't know his opinion on alien, but the reason why he uses that language is because he's talking to normies, or worse, Republicans. Many of those kind of people will shut down if you refer to someone as unhoused or undocumented. We need to ensure our rhetoric is effective in order to affect change. Then we can work on the dehumanizing language. Otherwise, you're putting the cart before the horse. Now, obviously, he agreed. He actually followed me back after this, which I thought was pretty fucking crazy. But this person responded, I disagree. There are people who won't agree on the substance even if you accept their terms. I'd like someone in Congress who speaks to their constituents in a humane, respectful manner. But if inserting undocumented is too much, then I hope the legislation makes up for it. This is someone who is more focused on the aesthetics of what is being said, the aesthetics of the argument, versus the actually being effective. And this is something I've seen in a lot of discourse these days. A lot of people will talk about being a lot of people will talk about the words being used and not go any deeper than those words. This is like the crusade against certain words on social media, like TERF or the N-word or various slurs. And there's no algorithm, no way to determine if someone is actually racist or if they're just using a term that we have deemed as racist. And it's important to make that distinction because words have meaning. And sometimes we need to be able to refer to those words. But when we state that a word is just bad, it's always bad, then first of all, it does give that word a lot of power, but it also means that we can't use that word where it would be appropriate. Now, I agree that some words just never have an appropriate use, but that's not really the purpose of this discussion. What I'm referring to mostly are words that, like, the pushback I've seen some people give against the term woke scolds. Now, I've talked about this a little bit before on the channel. Woke scolds are generally left-leaning people, but a woke scold doesn't have to be. Right, fascists can woke scold each other. They just don't. But essentially what a woke scold is someone who is holier than thou. There's someone who believes that their opinion, their way of the world is right, and if you don't accept that, then you are wrong. And there's a bunch of issues. I'm not going to go into woke scolds here. I'm just talking about how when you try to... when a term comes along that perfectly defines a situation or a group of people, and someone comes along and says, oh, we can't use that word for whatever reason, then what you've done is you've not actually improved the discourse. You've simply made it more difficult to talk about a problem. And I've always loved language, the way words, sentences, statements are constructed, the way a tiny turn of phrase can change the entire meaning of what you're saying. And as someone who has studied these things, who has looked into this, who has read about it, it's always funny to me to come across someone who is not interested in what someone actually believes, but simply the words that are coming out of their mouth, metaphorically speaking, when we're talking about social media. There's a lot of discourse. In fact, right now there's a rather lively debate going on between Vaush and Count Dankula about whether Dankula is a white nationalist. And of course, Dankula's whole thing is that he hides behind comedy. It's all just a joke. This is so common on the right that it's a fucking meme. But as one of the great philosophers of our time said, I joke when I say I'm the best in the booth, but a lot of truth is said in jest. That's true. There's a lot of things that are said as a joke, but are they really a joke? And even if you do truly mean them as a joke, does that mean that they can't be used by other people to reinforce their own beliefs and opinions? That's the real issue. It's impossible to tell what someone means just by the words they say. So you have to look at their actions as well. But that's not the purview of this discussion. However, there are some things you can tell by a person's words. And someone who consistently makes off-color, bigoted jokes probably has some latent bigotry. And I know, fucking ice cold take. But the language we use is shaped by our worldview. Again, obvious, I know. But I feel I need to establish this because there are a lot of people who think that language doesn't impact our thoughts and feelings, doesn't impact our beliefs in any meaningful way. And those people are just wrong. There are multiple studies that show that use of certain words or phrases or bits of rhetoric in a joking or harmless manner will change people's outlook. That, like, even if you're just saying it alone in your room, like yelling at a screen or at the proverbial yelling at the wall, that saying racial slurs will cause you to potentially be more or be less charitable to those groups of people. It can create somewhat racist feelings in your life, in your. And I think this is also something that we've seen with the pandemic, the way that the government and bootlickers talk about the economy as if it was some physical object that could be that is either well or sick, and that our actions have some sort of impact on. When people talk about the economy, what they're talking about is a massive collection of the jobs that are available, the jobs that are filled, how well those jobs are paid, people making income through other non-traditional job sources. And the important thing about all of those is that they're determined by people. They're determined by us, by the workers, by average people who do their job or don't and get paid or don't. So when there's been a lot of discourse, especially over the last month or two, about the economy and how we need to get the economy up and moving. And the problem with this is that when you think about the economy in the abstract like that, like we need to put the economy back to work, it removes the idea that the economy that the economy is made up of people. And so when you're asking people, when there's a novel coronavirus with no cure, no therapy, and no vaccine going around, and you're asking those people to go back to work in this situation, you're effectively saying, we don't care if you die. We don't care what happens to you. We just want to make sure that the bosses at the top make money. And that is why they use that rhetoric. To go back to Steve Cox here, he responded to Atmospheric Blues, her question about how can a person be illegal if it's only a matter of documentation? It's legal documentation. I get that, but I've seen right-wingers exploit the language to direct the conversation not on an immigrant's documentation, but to them being criminals. They imply immigrants bank on welfare, skirt taxes, and commit crimes. The hate against immigrants is real. Notice how this is a complete non sequitur. She's not talking about... So, Steve's whole point here is that when he is talking to, as I point out, normies or worse Republicans, he needs to use language they will understand. It's very simple if you use houseless to mean homeless people. It's very easy if you're talking about... It's very easy for, especially Republicans, to just completely shut down if you talk about someone who is houseless or unhoused, or when you talk about undocumented immigrants. Because then you're just another SJW who isn't interested in talking about the real issues. You just want to virtue signal or whatever they say. So this is a non sequitur. Right-wingers will exploit our language. That everyone exploits language. This is not... I hate living next to train tracks. So Steve responded to this non sequitur. It is. The hate against immigrants is real. But they never stop using that language anyway, so what does it actually change? I agree, but when it comes... I'm not sure what she's agreeing with, except that they never stop using the language. When it comes to the legislation, mostly immigrants or families of mixed statuses pay attention to the details. Most Americans don't know the green card process or how to obtain a visa. Immigrants are constituents as well, but they're usually shut out from the convo. Agreed. So what he's saying here is that if he wants to be effective, if you want to affect change, your rhetoric needs to be effective. It needs to appeal to the people who are willing to make that change. And unfortunately, right now, there are a number of legislators who do not care about woke language, who do not care about the dehumanization of referring to someone as an illegal immigrant or an alien. So when you do that, when you use that language, then it just gives them a reason to dismiss you. And while I'm not trying to say that people will not, while I'm not trying to say that you won't get dismissed for other reasons, there's no sense handing our enemies a very strong common reason to dismiss us. So if you're trying to affect change, if you want to be an agent of change, you need to use effective rhetoric. That means that while, yes, homeless, illegal, alien, these do dehumanize the people they're referring to, it's important that when you are using it's important to look past the words someone uses and look at their actions. So when someone calls someone an illegal immigrant, but they're otherwise a progressive would-be legislator who wants to create a better world, well, then are they really being dehumanizing? Or are they just there to... Or are they just trying to be effective? And this is something that I think about a lot. It's part of the reason why sometimes when I'm talking I can seem a little halting, where I'm doing a very exaggerated Shatner where I'm stopping between words, because I want to make sure the words I'm saying are correct. I'm doing this all without a script, of course. It's all live. And I have a document with a few points I wanted to hit, but when you're talking about making changes, or even just inspiring people, as I'm trying to do, then you have to consider whether the words you are using are the correct ones. And if they're not, then they're not going to be effective. Now, sometimes you can't tell. You can't tell whether words are going to be effective until you try them. And it's as simple as that. But, using these woke words like undocumented, houseless, that doesn't help. That's not to say that we can denigrate these people or that they should be dehumanized or any ridiculous thing like that. It just means that by using those woke terms, you are less effective than if you were using terms that most people can understand. For anyone who was here on Tuesday, we went over the American Johnson video on nuance. And one of the things I talked about in that video, I don't know if anyone actually heard it, but he used a lot of the dialogue was very, very opaque. It was clearly meant for people who already understood who he was talking about and the issue he was referring to. That's not effective rhetoric. Effective rhetoric is words that most people will understand. So we see this a lot, especially when you're looking at high-level game discussion. I don't know if it's something to do with the way gamers were ostracized or marginalized for years or what, but gamers tend to develop a huge lexicon of different words that people don't understand. And this makes it more difficult for new players to get in. Those who know me know that I've been a huge Magic the Gathering nerd for about almost 20 years now. And I've followed Mark Rosewater for most of that time. Mark Rosewater is the lead designer for Magic the Gathering. It is his job to essentially lead the design of each set and create a vision playbook for each set, where he comes up with an elevator pitch, and then he creates, working with other people, of course, creates examples of mechanics and cards to go into that set. And there's a few things he's said over and over again that I think apply well outside of Magic. There is the first one is the one I already talked about, how if something doesn't have a name, you can't talk about it. You can't talk about an issue without a way to refer to it. To refer back to woke scolds, if I have to define what a woke scold is every time I want to talk about it, like if I have to say I'm talking about the people who think that who are trying to be, God, woke school is such a perfect word that it's hard for me to actually define it. These are people who believe that they are holier than you, that they are more virtuous than you, and that you should try to live up to it, but you never will because you're a horrible, flawed human being. So oftentimes when someone tries to prevent a term from catching on, it's because they don't want to talk about it. Woke scolds will often try to deny the term woke scold. Will say that it's a bad word, that because it was apparently coined by Ben Shapiro. So if it was coined by Ben Shapiro, then it's a bad thing, even though it's a perfectly useful, perfectly cromulent word? Nah. Sorry. So that is one thing. If you want to talk about something, you need a word or short phrase to talk about it. Another thing he's talked about is, and this is something that comes up a lot, this is his personal blog. It's personal in that he runs it himself. It's all about Magic. Mostly about Magic. And one of the things he gets a lot is questions about why you don't keyword this or keyword that. Why don't you keyword certain mechanics that keep cropping up? And there are two major responses he gives. The first, which is not relevant to our discussion, is that it's just not used often enough to justify keywording. The other is that the more keywords they have, the more new players need to learn. So let's just look up, let's see, I don't know if this is even a thing. Yes, I meant League of Legends lexicon. Okay. So let's look at all the words someone would need to learn to become a passable League of Legends player. So we've got 1v1. That one most people could probably pick up. AA? What's that? AAS? ABAM? All these words, all these are words that either have different connotations based on the game or are completely invented for League of Legends. Now, at its core, League is a fairly simple game for a competitive multiplayer game. You've got, your multiple champions. You've got 3 lanes to work with. You need to take down, 2 or 3 towers, and then the inhibitor, and then take out your opponent's whatever. I forget the name of the goal. But if you listen to high-level league play and listen to what the players are saying to each other, if you are not steeped in this, it is completely impenetrable and opaque. This is why it's so hard to get into League. Because and to be fair, Magic has many of these same issues. But the problem is that these are things that you need to know to be involved in League discussions. Not necessarily to play League, but again, to discuss it. And this is what makes these games so opaque for some people. Because it's hard for them to catch on when someone tells them to babysit Baron while I push mid. What? And if you get into something like WoW, or I'm assuming FF14, or any other MMOs, it can get even more opaque and even more hard to grok. And this is something that Mark Rosewater has said multiple times. We want to make sure that we keep the initial cognitive load of anyone trying to join the game as low as possible. So if you need to learn 50 keywords just to be able to understand and parse what a card does, that is a bad system. This is why in Magic, they try to keep the mechanics pretty Nexus, that's what it is, damn it. That's why they try to keep the mechanics in a given set pretty simple. I've wandered rather far afield, but language is important. The words we use are very important. But if your focus is on aesthetics rather than effectiveness, then what you're going to do is create a world that is perfect and beautiful and completely incapable of actually changing anything. This is why we push back so hard against woke schools. I say we. This is why some people on social media push back against woke schools. Against these people who, again, I mentioned the Mexi Vosh discussion yesterday. She said that Vosh should apologize for what he's done, to which Vosh replied, I will apologize if they can explain what I've done wrong. And I think that's reasonable. I think it's reasonable to expect someone to apologize if you can explain what they've done is wrong. Because if you just tell someone, you know what you did is wrong, that's not a good argument. That's literally just... When you say that, what you're essentially saying is, I'm not going to explain what you did wrong, you should know. And if you didn't, that's a failing, or you're lying to me. And it's a common tactic of these woke scold people. And I'm not exactly calling Mexi a woke scold. She kind of displayed some of those tendencies yesterday, but this isn't about her. When you try to shut someone down, when you try to say, you don't have the right to speak about that, but you don't give any other arguments, all you're doing is shutting down discourse. And that's a bad thing. Shutting down discourse is almost always have bad outcomes, in my experience and opinion. Because when you shut down discourse, you're preventing anything new being learned about whatever you're shutting down. And if you think there's any subject on this earth or any other planet where we have all the information about it and we don't need to discuss it anymore, I got a bridge to sell you, my dude. Sorry. Everything is up for discussion. Now, that doesn't mean that we can just say whatever we want. We still need to be respectful. We still need to be cognizant of other people's feelings. But to say that you don't have a right to talk about that is just trying to exclude people from the discussion who may have valuable input. Now, I know that oftentimes this is used by marginalized group to prevent privileged groups from infiltrating the discussion, from taking over the discussion and speaking about issues which they don't necessarily have any knowledge about. However, there's a difference between saying, okay, we've listened to you and you don't seem to have anything to say about this that's useful or relevant, so we're gonna move on, and just saying, oh, you're white, you don't have anything, you don't belong in this discussion. And I know this sounds really shitty, this may sound really shitty coming from a cishet white dude, but we're all in this together. We truly are. I know that's a meme going around about the coronavirus, but the truth is, we are all in this together. We are all one people. We're all human. We are all living on this planet. And if someone comes up with a good idea, I could not care less about their demographics. And I understand that there is a long history of white people coming into marginalized spaces and taking them over and making them ineffective. Which is why we need to make sure everyone is equipped with good rhetoric, so that people don't come in and take over a space maliciously, and to make sure that when someone who doesn't belong to a demographic starts advocating for that demographic, they're doing so intelligently and effectively and not just aesthetically. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to like, share, and leave a comment because it helps me. Subscribe and ring that bell to help you. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.